Now, right at the start here, I do want to warn you that there may be some minor spoilers in this video for Spider-Man Far From Home. So if you don't want absolutely anything ruined at all, I do recommend clicking away now and coming back after you've seen it if you want to. Okay, and with that out of the way, let me say that I did think Spider-Man Far From Home was a good MCU movie, but maybe not the best Spider-Man movie ever. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, one thing I personally love about the character of Spider-Man, or Peter Parker, is that he's usually just one kid versus the world, if you will, or against this big threat that a high school kid has no business tackling by himself, superpowers or no. And yet, not only does he face it with little or no help, because very few people, if anyone, knows he's actually Spider-Man, he finds a way to prevail because of his own gumption and ingenuity mostly. He's making his own suits from scratch, figuring the plans of these villains he's facing out on his own, all the while trying to go to school, have some sort of social life, and to make a couple bucks as a photographer for the Daily Bugle to fund everything. And those are the things, in my opinion at least, that make Spider-Man one of the absolute best comic book characters of all time. And that's one of the reasons Stan Lee initially created the character, to make him this average kid that a lot of people could easily relate to. A kid who just so happened to be bit by a radioactive spider and to be gifted with these crazy powers, and to learn how to be responsible with them. And in many ways, he's the opposite of a character like Iron Man or Tony Stark. However, the shadow of that character, of Tony Stark, hangs very heavily over this movie, and at times this almost feels more like Iron Man 4, The Passing of the Torch, than it feels like a new Spider-Man film, because the narrative is so heavily wrapped around Iron Man's legacy. And Peter is not only dealing with the loss of his mentor in this film, which Tony Stark very much was, but Spider-Man, much like in the last few movies, is using a lot of Iron Man's tech and resources, instead of finding his own ways to somehow get things done. And I'm not saying the movie is bad because of that, it's just different from what you might normally expect out of a Spider-Man film. Not to mention, the Peter Parker, Tony Stark arc throughout the MCU has been a great one. Tony brings Peter in to help him in Civil War, and because of that, he feels responsible for him and wants to have him go back to being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But Peter has now had a taste of the big leagues and wants to deal with Avenger-level threats all the time, which is what we see in Spider-Man Homecoming. Then he ends up going to space, fighting Thanos, and being knighted an Avenger by Tony in Infinity War. After which, and in the newest movie here, he begins to wonder if that's what he really wants. Yet at the same time, with Iron Man gone, the world seems to be wondering who will take his place, despite the fact we still have a lot of other Avengers around, and I'll get to more on that later. And so Peter doesn't know if being the next Iron Man is what he wants to be anymore. He's just a teenager, after all, who wants what he wants when he wants it, and doesn't want to do what he doesn't want to do. Again, average teenager. So yeah, I do like that aspect of this film for what it is, that he's not sure if being Spider-Man and a full-time Avenger is what he really wants out of life, but the ghost of Tony Stark hangs over this film just way too much. Which kind of ties into my next issue here, that this shouldn't have been the first film after Endgame, though I get why they probably did it. They wanted something a bit more lighthearted and fun, which Spider-Man can certainly offer. But there was almost a bit too much goofiness here. Because, as we've seen in the trailer, so this isn't a spoiler, Peter and his class go on a European school trip, and they make the two teachers chaperoning them such bumbling idiots that they come off just feeling irritating and their jokes fall flat with me. I get why they made them that way, because a decent teacher would have better control over the students, and wouldn't just let Peter roam away whenever he needs to do some Spider-Man stuff. But again, they were just so goofy, as were other aspects of this film when dealing with the students and the class trip in general. Also, the first 15 to 20 minutes of this movie is rather boring because it deals almost exclusively with the trip and the students. It also feels almost out of place to me because we have to keep in mind what's recently happened in this world and what we also last saw in the MCU. That being the snap, or as they call it, the blip, where half the population randomly reappeared after disappearing for 5 years. And though this movie does open by giving us some pure exposition about the blip and some of the fallout, like how many people are now homeless because of it, all of this is very soon forgotten. We're led to believe that, for the most part, the whole world just went back to normal very shortly after what happened, that high school kids are just taking field trips to Europe again just a few months after all of this has gone down. And don't get me wrong here, in comic books, things reset back to normal all the time after these huge world-changing events. New York has been destroyed who knows how many hundreds of times in the pages of Marvel Comics, yet come next issue, it's good as new and people are still living there, despite the fact that it's attacked by supervillains pretty much every other day. And so part of me is okay with the reset button pretty much getting hit here, but part of me really wanted Endgame to have some serious weight to it after the fact. A part of me wanted this to be a changed world, still looking for a way to recover. That's why I think, again, Spider-Man was an odd choice for the first movie back after Endgame, because it's always more fun and lighthearted in nature in a Spider-Man film. Then there's also the fact that Peter was off in Europe instead of home in New York, maybe dealing with a villain trying to capitalize off the blip, just like in his last film, he dealt with a villain who was trying to capitalize off the invasion of New York that we see in the first Avengers film. That's what Spider-Man is good at and has always been about, defending his home turf. Instead, in this movie, he's basically dealing with an Avengers-level threat by himself. And yeah, I know Iron Man and Cap are gone, but what exactly are the other Avengers doing right now? How are all of them busy? How is not one of them on standby just in case something like this happened? The world is recovering from yet another alien attack, if you will, and not a single Avenger is on standby? And so Spider-Man is the only one to deal with it, but he's not dealing with it in the Spider-Man way, he's dealing with it in the Tony Stark Iron Man way mostly. And so I really feel like this movie almost suffers from the context around it or its place in the MCU, which is the first time I've ever said that about a Marvel movie. Because at the core here, the story of Peter grappling with what he personally wants versus his responsibility as Spider-Man and trying to juggle the two somehow, well, it works. Hell, it always works. It's always the best part of Spider-Man stories and what I love about these films. Again, I love it when it's just Spider-Man trying to do and figure things out on his own, on his very limited budget. But this movie is lacking that. It's lacking a certain charm. Yes, Peter's still creative and he's still good at figuring things out and coming up with a plan all on his own, but he's also got a lot of other characters around him to help now. Not to mention a lot of resources that Peter Parker doesn't usually have at his disposal. So again, this isn't a bad MCU or superhero film. There's a great story here and some good twists and turns, and there's certainly some fantastic battles and beautiful use of CGI as well, but it's just not a classic Spider-Man film in many respects. Though that's not meant to take anything away from Tom Holland, who plays the character, because I think he does a fantastic job, and he's a great Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and his relationship with MJ in this film is great, and the chemistry between the two really works, and it's one of the highlights of the movie. The other supporting characters in Peter's life, not so much. His best friend Ned, who I really liked in the first movie, is kind of left looking for a part to play in this film. He's given his own little subplot of sorts, which feels like it's just there for the sake of him having something to do. Then there's Flash Thompson, and though I didn't like him in the first movie, at least it felt like there was a point to the character, whereas in this one, there really isn't. I get that he's supposed to be a modern take on a bully or something, but 20-some years ago when I was in high school, he would have been the kid the bullies of my generation picked on. Then there's Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio, who really steals the show here and does a fantastic job. He puts this movie over for me in many respects, and there's a great dynamic all around here between him and Peter that really the movie should have focused even more on, I think. So all in all here, as I said at the start, I feel like this was a good MCU movie, that as a transition away from the first three phases of the MCU, or the Cap and Iron Man era, to this whole new one, well, this works rather well. This kind of propels us forward and away from the past and begins to tell us that someone else is going to have to step up and fill the shoes of Cap and Iron Man, who were very much the heart and soul of the original Avengers team. And again, the first three phases of the MCU really were their story, so it makes sense that in some respect, they'd want someone to directly carry on their legacies. And clearly, Spider-Man is going to be a core character of this broader era of the MCU that is just beginning, as will Falcon, who received Cap's shield at the end of Endgame, and the third core character I'd imagine will be Captain Marvel. And whether or not this trio can be anywhere near as engaging and carry the weight of the overall story of the MCU the way the previous trio did, is certainly yet to be seen, but as a fan of the franchise, I do hope it all works out. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought about Spider-Man Far From Home, assuming you've seen it. Did you love it, hate it, or fall somewhere in between? And did this feel like a true Spider-Man movie to you, or do you perhaps agree with me that it's almost burdened by being a part of the MCU in this case? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.